confident in the knowledge that it is striving for the national interest, just expects the rest of the country to let it get on with the job. I hear a few sounds of recognition of that thought. The national security community needs to accept that intensive, sophisticated public consultation and outreach will be a constant requirement and a priority for policy making. It's not window dressing, it's not an afterthought, it's not a box to tick. It's core business, and we need to keep trying to do it better. And if this observation comes from my having spent the past 8 years living in Sydney and engaging with business and other parts of the Australian community, including multicultural Australia, well, so be it. We have to work much harder to ensure that the security debate in Canberra is recognisable to the wider population and is recognisably in their interests. This is a necessary, but it's also an achievable task because, like it or not, national security is becoming everyone's problem. That's why it must now be, in my view, a national priority to ensure that no part of the community feels like it's being treated as the problem. For instance, we should not be critical of a whole community, Muslim Australians, based on the actions of a tiny minority of misguided individuals. Those are not originally my words, but those of former ASIO Director General David Irvin, who's with us today and who I'm pleased to announce today will be joining the National Security College as a visiting fellow. The need to ensure that national security policy is owned right across Australian society is also why government is correct to seek to connect the idea of citizenship with the idea of responsibility as well as rights. Incidentally, on the eve of the Gallipoli landings, of the centenary of the Gallipoli landings, there's a good case for more to be done to associate Australia's Anzac history with civic values of citizenship and responsibility rather than with heritage. And I think there is a risk in associating Anzac too much with heritage. We're beginning to see some of that in my view. There are many in the community who seem to think that national security is not their problem, or indeed who think that national security policy is the problem. It's an unwarranted affront to liberties, it's a sinister political trick, it's a diversion from other government priorities in tough fiscal times, it just keeps us in business. Now, those who sincerely hold those views need to be willing to suspend their preconceptions or their posturing, suspend the conspiracy theories, and engage in a first principles conversation. This should be an open-minded conversation about how best to preserve the security and the cohesion of the society that has afforded all of us levels of political freedom, of personal opportunity and physical safety that most of humanity has never experienced. Now, as some have observed, the national conversation about security so far is not really a conversation at all. It's been a case of very different constituencies and communities talking across one another. In addition to our core work here at the National Security College in training government officials and providing academic education, core work that I need to maintain and will maintain as absolute priorities of the college, the National Security College will contribute to that conversation. We're proudly part of a leading research university, so much of that contribution should be through rigorous and independent research that we will commission and we will support. Our researchers hold diverse views and they express them, and they'll continue to do so. We will also be a platform, however, and a convener for constructive dialogue and discussion with the national interest at heart. One way to get this national security conversation onto a more fruitful path is to recognise that Australia's security problem requires multiple responses across multiple timescales. On terrorism, for example, there's little question that counter-radicalisation and showing the emptiness of the Islamic State narrative are essential tasks. But even the best efforts on these fronts will take time and trust building. In the meantime, it's imperative not only to minimise the number of Australians attracted to the terrorist cause at home or overseas, but to minimise the harm that they can do. Right now, the most pressing national security priority must be to prevent further atrocities of a kind that would damage social harmony in multicultural Australia and inflict damage that we do not yet know how we would repair. The question then becomes how to maximise the security community's chance of success in preventing terrorist violence without poisoning the nation's medium and long-term capacity to erode the appeal of terrorist propaganda. This is not a choice, both are priorities. Thus, it's incumbent on the critics of counter-terrorism measures to offer their best ideas on how to reduce the chances of further terrorist attacks, or alternately, to acknowledge their willingness to risk those attacks and their potentially dreadful impact on Australia's core qualities of social tolerance and trust. A new and inclusive Australian security approach must extend to other risks as well. It will involve a recognition that we need to face multiple challenges at once, some that can be met or deterred by limited by principally military means, but others that cannot. A new Australian security will involve a recognition that seeking to mitigate or adapt to the security implications of challenges like climate change is not an alternative strategy to ensuring that we have a leading-edge military designed to guard our interests against a breakdown in an uncertain regional order. Again, we need to do both. The timescale is not the same for every threat. In fact, some threats are going to confront us more in the immediate years ahead than in the long term, so it may be a matter of weathering the storm. That means we cannot be complacent about old-fashioned threats like state-on-state coercion, which are very real today, just because we're mindful of pressures like climate change into the future. Ultimately, a new and inclusive approach to Australian security requires that as a nation, we step up our efforts to engage and employ all the qualities we have: advanced technology, strategic geography, a strong ally, promising partners, a private sector increasingly conscious of security, an educated population, exceptional cultural diversity, and of course our democratic system, our democratic values. Thus, the fact that the Australian Defence Force and other policy and security agencies are lifting their game in ethnic and gender diversity is good, but it's not good enough. To match the new shape and the potential of Australia's dynamic society, patterns of recruitment and employment in the security community will need fresh attention. Cyber capabilities, for instance, could well be a natural fit for a new kind of reservist, a national cyber security reserve involving creative work arrangements and flexible exchanges with private industry would transform traditional notions of what soldiering is about and what new generations with new skills can do for their country. And I hasten to add, this may be a civilian reserve, it may not be strictly a military reserve. It's something new. We haven't yet sort of imagined even what it could be. There's a pilot project in the UK underway at the moment that might provide some insight. So just as Australia's political and social history has been about increasing inclusion, so too would I argue that inclusiveness will be the essential quality of a new Australian security. To conclude, that is inclusiveness in several ways: a wide, inclusive definition of national security interests, an inclusive understanding of the means by which we need to protect and advance those security interests, and finally, an inclusive, flexible mobilisation of our diverse national assets: people, the private and public sectors, geography, technology and partnerships, both within other countries or with other countries and within our own country. As we know, as we're taught, I guess, security is the first duty of government. Even so, the idea that I've proposed tonight of a new and inclusive Australian security may be open to the accusation, to use the academic term, of securitising the issues rather too much, and I stand accused. But such are the times we live in, and such, in my view, is the challenge ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Lazarus. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. With the situation which happened in Sydney in the Lit Cafe, it seemed to me very obvious that Monis was a very dangerous individual who really should have been under surveillance from ASIO. He was out loud there saying, you know, I'm an Islamist, I'm violent, I hate government. Yet he wasn't under any proper surveillance from ASIO. What would you say to ASIO about that? And what would you say also to the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, who started to criticise Muslim leaders for not speaking out enough against Islamist radicalisation in the context that I think they are, and they've been promised a lot of money for programs to carry out counter-Islamist radicalisation programs, but the federal government hasn't actually delivered that money. So what would you say to Tony Abbott and what would you say to ASIO about those two things?
Thanks. That's two very substantial questions, and two important questions. And I think, just very briefly, what I'd say to the first part of that question, I mean, as you know, there's been a review. It's pretty exhaustively looked at the history, Monis's history leading up to this incident, and obviously this has led to a lot of hand-wringing about a kind of failure, but not, it appears, a systemic failure. It's a string of failures, and of course there's now been plenty of movement to try and address those kind of, shall we call them, gaps in the system in the future. There's no guarantee, of course, that another incident like this couldn't occur, or that another individual like this is out there, or that he'll be stopped by these kind of methods again in the future. But I think that, as I've said earlier, lessons were learned, state and federal, and this will be pursued into the future. I wouldn't really have more to say to ASIO than that. But the second point, I think, is actually more important to the message about social cohesion that I was trying to convey today. Now, the Prime Minister's national security statement, and I'll use that term even though it wasn't a complete national security statement a couple of weeks ago, I think was less controversial and more balanced in its substance than a lot of the media coverage would have us believe. Unfortunately, there have been plenty of instances we can name where some of our political leaders, including this Prime Minister, have decided to add one or two lines to their statements that they really didn't need to add, and that frankly were counterproductive to their core message. And you're obviously alluding to a line that the PM made like that. But I think that's got to be taken in the context of the relatively uncontroversial measures in that statement. I think the relatively wide potential for community support of some of those measures, of most of those measures, and particularly on this point about community mobilisation. It's not true to say that there's no resourcing out there for that. The resourcing is less than I'd like it to be, but there are grants available. The challenge is to build trust with community organisations to take those grants up and begin putting them into practice. And that's precisely why I've made the point. I mean, you just said Muslim leaders have a different view about that. Precisely why I've made the point that we, the national security community, needs to be a lot more constant and a lot more intensive in its engagement and consultation. And interestingly, the example I've been given is the New South Wales Police, who 20 or 30 years ago, if you said these are a model of cultural sensitivity and politeness, you would have been sort of laughed at. But in fact, their experience in Western Sydney in the past 20 years has been increasingly positive, and community leaders have told me that that's the model, constant contact with members of the community that needs to be followed by federal agencies. One of our problems is that we have a federal system and federal agencies haven't been regularly on the ground in some of these communities, and if they had been in less difficult times, people would have wondered why. So I take your points on board.
I'm Bill Tao. I'm the head of the International Relations Department in the Bell School. Rory, thanks for your wonderful and, dare I say it, magisterial tour de horizon of the strategic environment in Australia's position within it. Two other rising stars in addition to yourself in the country's national security community, Nick Bisley and Andrew Phillips, recently wrote a piece for the IISS journal Survival, in which they argued that the US pivot strategy, and by extension Australia's role in it, is really too broad. And what they argue is that in terms of prioritization, which you've talked about in your address, really Northeast Asia is where the action is, and that to move amongst to too broad of a geographic circumference would actually dilute the effectiveness of both the United States and its allies' efforts to